Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another discussion with Fatima and Sheila from the Unerased Book Club. Tonight, we are here to discuss Antiman by Rajiv Mohibar. And before we get started, we could just quickly go around and introduce ourselves. I'm Lucy. I work at the library as a library technician in youth services. So I do a lot of youth programming, but I also really enjoy these book discussions.
My name is Amanda. I also work at the library as a library technician in the youth department. And I also do programming for kids, teens, adults, a lot of virtual programs now. And that involves a lot of online programming on our YouTube channel, including book discussions. So I'm happy to be here tonight with everybody.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I also work at the library and I am a library technician in the archives. And I get to participate in these discussions sometimes, which is always awesome. So thank you for having me.
Hi, and I'm Jacob. I'm also a library employee. I'm an outreach technician. So what we do is we reach out to the community. And one of the ways we get to do that is stuff like this, which is really exciting. So
I'm Fatima, and I am a co-facilitator of the Unerased Book Club.
And I'm Sheila, the founder and facilitator of the Unerased Book Club. And while I do not work at a library, I'm a huge fan and big patron. And so we like to just start off every book club with a very basic question, which is, how did this book make you feel? So I'll just open that up, throw that out to the group.
I guess I'll start by saying I really enjoyed the book. I was really engrossed in the story, but there were a few times that I was punched in the gut, when people did things to him that were just so awful and unconscionable to me, but makes sense in the broader landscape of American culture. So yeah, that was my initial reaction.
Well, I really enjoyed the book. I loved the format, which was new to me. And I also had moments of being punched in the gut, but I just finished it recently and I felt like this really beautiful aside at the end, oh, this was lovely. I love the journey. I love hearing all of the challenges in his life. And I particularly loved the family and the family history and his perception of how he was putting it inwards and outwards. So for me, it was just, I thought I had a very positive feeling at the end of this hopefulness just for him and for people in general, I guess.
And it was wonderful to leave on that note because, as you guys touched on, the book was traumatic. It made me feel anger. It made me feel almost like a childlike sense of frustration. Oh, why can't you just why can't you just be nice? But it was also so cathartic, and there's a sense of fun. I felt so much, but to echo what Amanda said, at the end of the book, there was kind of this sigh almost it's gonna be okay, was kind of a feeling, which is a good feeling to end on.
Yeah, I think that I agree with that. And I think part of it was he feels this self-hatred throughout the whole book that is really sort of given to him by his father, among other people, but he internalizes it. And at the end, I loved his relationship with his grandmother. And then he realizes that she was proud of him and that he has this moment of shifting in his mind from self-hatred to self-love. So it really helped end it on that positive note.
I think for our listeners who might not be as familiar with the book, I just want to mention that this is a memoir by a Guyanese Indian American author. I mean, I feel like he's got multiple identities. It's a lot about growing up as a queer person, growing up as an immigrant in Central Florida, among other spaces. And I honestly loved so much of this book, and I felt so all of it felt very familiar in a way. even though there was a lot of unfamiliarity in terms of context or historical backgrounds or things like that, but a lot of familiarity and a deep sense of like being seen by the book, because so much of it resonated. So, and yeah, I just loved it. It was great.
Yeah, I when I saw this book at the Ferndale Library, it was so prominently displayed, and the cover is beautiful. It's like much like the book bills itself as a hybrid memoir. It is feels like a mashup, like a collage almost on the front, and that drew my eye to it. And honestly, I was a little wary of reading it because I thought it was going to be so steeped in trauma that there would be joy to take out of it. But like maybe 20% of the way in, I text Fatima, like, we have to, first you have to read this, but also we have to read this for the book club. And it, like Amanda said, like the joy and that you get at every step of the way, and it really enables a reader to dive in and not feel weighed down by like the reality of violence that surrounds marginalized communities. My favorite part in terms of the way it's structured of the book is the usage, the heavy usage of Bhojpuri songs and the translation bits. I find that to be so refreshing and such a interesting way to like trick your brain into re-engaging in the story.
I think the way he framed those songs too, by putting them in like 3 languages, is it almost shows you the translation process, you know, like here's how I'm bringing this to you, but here's what it means to other people. And I just think that having it in those 3 separate languages was really effective.
And it also seemed important that because these were his Aji's songs, it's like these need to be ink paper, these need to be put on paper, you know what I'm saying? That felt like an important statement in itself. And when you consume those songs and his poems with the 3 different languages, it felt like the layers of what this thing is were revealed to me as a Caucasian Midwestern reader.
I also thought about, as I was reading it, like he talks about his experience in the MFA program and how he's expecting it to be this inclusive environment, despite being told by other people that's like not going to be that way. He's like, well, this program has a lot of South Asian people in it. Like, surely it's going to be a great experience. And then he gets all this feedback that's like, why are you including this language? It's not effective in the way you think. And then he goes on to do this, and I think it is effective, and I'm really happy that he was able to do it.
I mean, Jacob, your point about like understanding it more as somebody who's not from that culture at all. I'm from a neighboring culture, and I found it so impactful. Like my family doesn't really practice Hinduism, so like the Hindu mythology part, I had to like search a little bit to triangulate it. But I don't speak Bhojpuri or understand Bhojpuri. So like that was in and of itself was like, oh, I get a glimpse into this culture that otherwise is completely erased. And to your point, Elizabeth, and part of the discussion we had with Rajiv yesterday is the ways that the diaspora, despite how small it is, like it has this incredible tendency to shut out smaller communities for fear of like losing the validity of an entire culture. It's a weird psychological cultural thing, but yeah, like when I read that part about his MFA experience, I was like, yeah, no, I know 100% where these people are coming from, and it's not great. It's a horrible like way of putting down other smaller communities.
Yeah, that part about like not feeling a sense of belonging because you come from a subset of the, you know, mainstream, that was very relatable for me as well. Like And I didn't really experience that until I got to college, because I grew up in a Bangladeshi community in Detroit, and most folks there are Sylheti Bangladeshis. And so they come from the same district of Bangladesh that myself and my family comes from. But when I got to the University of Michigan and I met other Bangladeshi folks, a lot of them came from the capital city of Bangladesh, or their families came from there. And so the dialect of Bengali they spoke was the standardized Bengali, and it was almost like, oh, but this is not real Bengali, what you speak, right? So even though you have fluency in the language, it doesn't count. And so I felt like that sort of thing happens so often, and I've never really seen it named quite so explicitly as it was in this book, of this othering and also rejecting of yourself, just because you come from a community that is not within the mainstream narrative or understanding of what it looks like to be a particular ethnicity or nationality. So I was just, yeah, again, very seen by that.
And I feel like every other page, he was confronting those thoughts and feelings from people he was having conversations with, or things he was internalizing. That is just so present in the book. But again, it's not, you feel for him, but it's not in a negative light. It's him discovering and figuring things out. There's one thing that I wrote down as a note, where we are not real people. We speak broken Hindi and broken English. So that thing of like, we are not enough of this or enough of that. And then the father with this whole, we are Christians and we don't speak this. And even when Aji dies at the end, just the family's reaction. And I love the mother and how she was trying to explain to her son, like they were embarrassed of her being Hindi, and you loved that about her. So you were putting a mirror in their faces and they are rejecting that. And I just love that he embraced that. So he could have dropped it. He could have kept all those thoughts and feelings, and he could have dropped it. He could have said, oh no, they are right. That is not me. That is not me. I'm just going to be my big queer person in the corner and not worry about, broken Hindi and broken English. But he took all of that and he put it into his writing. It's just phenomenal. The book, it was so much. It was just beautiful the way it was done.
Yeah, I think also by doing that, what you were saying, Amanda, he also gives a voice to his Aji, because, it's like she's also been told that not only, does she have broken Hindi and broken English, but like she's a broken person almost. And so I just think that in a way he was giving voice to her by putting her songs and her poems and just herself in this book and their relationship. And I also think like the part about his parents, and their conversion to Christianity, like it's interesting too, in a broader sense, that part of that they had to do, like in order to get an education, they were going to have to convert to Lutheranism. So I think that speaks to, it's like this broad picture and then this insular picture of his family too, and how that plays out.
Yeah, when again in the conversation that we had with Rajiv yesterday, he mentioned that aspect of like colonial scars and the forced conversion. And in all honesty, when I think of forced conversion, I think of like very like violent things, or like the Crusades, or whatever, the wars from 500 years ago. But it is a byproduct, I think, of how we talk about colonization, and how we don't talk about how violent it is. That like, even for somebody who reads a lot about this and thinks about it a lot, to hear that his parents had gone through a colonial Christian forced conversion was very, was really it felt really intense, and not like something I had already known. And I think that this entire book, the reason I have kept recommending it to people for the past few months since I read it the first time, is because he addresses such not difficult, but like important harsh topics with a lucidity that I guess I hadn't seen from that perspective in a long time. And like I don't know, the writing is just next level. And I'm so happy that even though his MFA peers were like, what you're doing isn't going to be effective, he just ignored that to bring this into the world.
I think I'd also forgotten that, or not forgotten, but I actually was not aware that missionaries or missions are still happening to this day. When I moved back to Bangladesh in 2009, actually it was in 2010, so a year after I moved back, I actually met some folks who had been missionaries in Bangladesh for a long time, and it just blew my mind because it was so unexpected. Somehow, one, I had never learned about this history because where would you learn it? And two, I didn't think that it existed as much in a developed spaces like Bangladesh. I think my one and only real exposure as a Muslim person, not exposed to very like a lot of Christian culture outside of the media. My only exposure was like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, like that, and how folks were converted there and forced conversion. So yeah, to know that it's very recent, it's still happening, or that people are still living out the impact because their parents experienced it or they themselves experienced it. Yeah.
I'm curious, what did people think about the hybrid style?
I felt that it propelled the book. It kept me reading because every other chapter or so you go, okay, now what the heck is this? Let me figure out what this is all about. I really appreciated, especially coming from a teaching background myself, the chapter that was like a lesson plan. I thought that was really cool. Keep your tomatoes, don't throw no tomatoes. But I did the chapters that were like, what's the dang word? The chapters that were like recordings of his Aji in Creole. I couldn't read them.
Mm-hmm.
No tomatoes, please.
No, I will admit I did something similar when she was singing in smaller bursts to him, or I read it more when it was her sentences and her dialogue in the text. But when it was full chunks, I kind of did a breeze through to see if I could not even understand it, but just to hear what it would have sounded like. But I didn't read it as intently as I would have like English, to something that I could take in. I was waiting for the translation. But I totally like the style, and I think it would have been a disservice if that wouldn't have been in the book, because it was such a big part of him in his writing. That he's a writer, and those are the words he wanted to write.
I definitely kept thinking, as a person who is really bad at pronouncing things I've never heard, that I wish that there was an audiobook. Maybe there is one, I didn't look, but I didn't have access to it. But like, I have been starting to get into listening to audiobooks, especially if they're read by the author. And I feel like this would have been a really good one, because I feel like it would have just been a next level experience to hear that oral history. But I do think that the writing it down is extremely important, despite the fact that us white English speaking Westerners can't read it, which I think is like part of the point, like we have to recognize that there's a reason we don't know this, and our ignorance is put on display there.
Yeah, not everything has to be, like you don't have to whitewash everything that's written out there. And I think that really underscored it. I also like the hybridity of it. I think like really is reflective of memory. I mean, you don't remember things in these nice big chunks of prose, so I just think the way he changed, the style throughout to me, it felt like you were really kind of going along with him as he's remembering these bits and pieces of things.
To your point, Elizabeth, about Jacob, Amanda, and Elizabeth's point about the Creole, or not Creole, the Pigeon, I thought, honestly, it was like a stark reflection of how Aji was both seen as worthless because she didn't speak English, because she wasn't Christian, because she was the daughter and granddaughter of indentured servants, that her life and her culture wasn't valuable. And to have that on display and make it impossible for others was like, no, you can be gate kept out of things too.
Mhm.
Which I really, really liked. And it was really, I mean, like, Bhojpuri is similar enough to Hindi. And so but like it's Pigeon Bhojpuri, which has been changed and morphed over generations. Like, oh, I do not know what is happening here. I tried so hard to read it, and I loved that I was not able to access it for that reason. Of like, he knows that something's valuable in here, and we don't get to access it, much like most of like the English speaking world or Western canon would never have been accessible to Aji.
I forget where he was. I think it may have been when he was in Wisconsin studying, where he sang the song and he wrote down the lyrics and he sang it. And then afterwards somebody asked him, hey, can I take that back? Can I have that? And he's like, I'll send it to you tomorrow. He's like, I'm never giving that person these words. Why would? And for this white person to sing, and yeah.
He also mentions that like a lot of white people will take these studies and make it like their whole personality, and like it took him a lot of work to find that. He had to connect to so many different things, like has to go to his family history, make this trip to India. Like, yeah, why do white people just feel like they can just have that?
And to echo that, so much of this book takes place in academic spaces. And it's just like, dang, academia is not really that cool. Like, y'all are being mean and not like educate. Like, I don't know. That was something that rang through the book for me. It's just like, and also how academia did have an effect on how he shaped his self-identity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, wow, that certainly played a role in the book. And I was like, I guess it's something that I stumbled upon that surprised me.
Yeah, it really named for me like what it's like, or how much work it is to learn within your own culture or your family group, right? It wasn't I mean, there were so many levels to it, right? First is like actually honoring his grandmother and recognizing that she has value, she has worth, and the experience of like us not being able to like, or skimming over the Pigeon, you know, or not reading it as closely as we might read something in English, right? That is the same experience of her not being heard because people had such a hard time understanding her, so they didn't want to put in that time and make that effort at all. And so I had to like consciously be like, okay, slow it down and actually read it. But for him to recognize the value of that, to have curiosity about it, to then ask questions, to do external research, to go to India and learn more about it, to put the pieces together, and to like do a lot of wide range research just to get to one point, just to be able to translate one piece of thing. And then to have someone else from an outsider perspective who doesn't have the internal baggage of like, this is not valuable, this is not worthy, you know, you come from this, so therefore you're not valuable and you're not worthy. Like they don't have to deal with any of that internal messaging or scripting and bypass that. So, but then for them to come in and be like, oh, I can just do something with this. I can totally market it. I can totally capitalize off of it. And like actually showing how that process works was also healing for me to read, because I work with a lot of expats in Bangladesh, and having had experience with that and seeing other folks kind of do similar things, it was a point of pain, and it still remains a point of pain for me. And it's still something that I'm unpacking. And I think this allowed me to unpack. And as Sheila mentioned earlier, like there's a great lucidity about it where he really lays it out in ways that you can understand it. It's not coded in any way. It's just there for you to take in and understand, whether you are a white reader or, someone who has experienced it as a person of color or an immigrant or whatever else.
Mhm.
I'm just thinking about how many jokes there are in India now about like not just non-Indians or people from the diaspora, but also people from the diaspora who come back and try to like fix problems or explain it away or try to capitalize, like find a business solution for systemic problems. And it's semi-related to this idea of cultural cannibalism, cultural cannibalism, and trying to like profit off of it. But it's so widespread in India that there's so many jokes about it now from Indians. Like everybody knows that you can easily turn the tables on those types of people or visitors who don't really know what they're talking about because they haven't invested that time. So it was a tangent, but it is weirdly commonplace in the comedy scene.
I guess to switch tracks a little bit, there's so much history in this book, and we were wondering how much of this were you familiar with, especially the Indo-Caribbean history, and what was new to you?
Like all of it. I mean, I think that, I didn't really know about, Indians being brought over like specifically to, I guess I did, but I didn't know about it in that region to specifically replace slave labor because you couldn't have slaves anymore. And it kind of reminded me of Passage West, which we read, in that, like, just this introduction of one group of people into another country that's not, it might go back earlier than people know, or it's just not known how it originated. So it was really new to me to learn that. And
I will just tag onto that and say I also didn't really know anything about it, so it was all pretty much new to me. I learned a lot.
No, same here. And when I was reading it too, it was sort of like a history lesson, but through his lens. And then I was trying to keep track of who came from where between like his mother and his father and his grandparents' backgrounds. And at first it was kind of a lot to I was kind of picturing a little map in my head and little arrows of where things were going. And I was like, don't get bogged down and knowing exactly every detail, just understand that this has happened. So that's sort of where I was trying to put together all of the information because it was important to the story and it was important to him and his person. But yeah, a lot of it was new to me as well.
And I'll be honest, I had a real dum-dum moment where I was like, how is Guyana in South America, but like it's Caribbean? And then I was like, look at a map. And that's the I say that to also bring up that when you are engaging with this book, you are a reader, but you are also a doer, if that makes any sense. I had to go do something to understand what was going on here. But yes, I had a geographical lesson as well.
My first introduction to Indo-Caribbean culture was in 2010 when I took a class on the Indian diaspora. This was during a study abroad at the University of Hyderabad. And that's when I was first able to piece together the like 600-year history of substantial numbers of South Asians or Indians leaving the continent, whether by force or by choice. And my first Indo-Caribbean friends were a few years after that. To the point of, like, I keep coming back to the MFA story, but that conversation of like mainstream or like mainland diaspora, just not knowing anything about Indo-Caribbeans is a very real part of how we continue to like divide ourselves by class, because people who came from, there's this idea that if you're Indo-Caribbean, you're lesser than because your parents, your family was so indentured servants, or you come from that lineage, and it's like a byproduct of our own like messed up social hierarchies. But when I learned about Indo-Caribbean culture, I was so intrigued, like how is this culture maintained? How are they like honoring the traditions and making it their own and melding it with Black cultures and other cultures on the island, or the countries where they were forcibly moved to. And when I got to tell Rajiv this yesterday, that it feels so important that such a hidden and actively hidden part of our small culture communities has now a book, and like a very visible book. Mm-hmm. And there's other books, so I'd recommend Holy Woman, and actually Sea of Poppies by Amitav Ghosh has a good amount of conversation about indentured servitude and the British forcibly or coercing young men and eventually women to those ships to send them off. So there's some literature, but it's quite sparse. And I hope that more writers come out of the woodwork and we're able to read their stories.
Yeah, for sure. I just want to say, when I say I learned a lot, it's like I barely scratched the surface, but like definitely want to learn more. It's such an interesting history and one that I think is really important for people to know. So I'm really glad that this book is out here, and I'm going to look and research more about it.
Yeah, my own experience with this actually happened quite early on, because one of my college dorm mates was from Trinidad. And so I got to, I think the most stunning thing for me was that she was an expert tabla player, and tabla is traditionally played by men only. And so for me, I was like, wait, you were allowed to learn that? And I think that sparked the curiosity of asking a lot of questions about how some of the ways in which the traditions are different, and also same, you know, at the same time. And I think our friendship was what led me to like learning a little bit more on a personal note of like exactly what happened during that time. You know, the way that folks were taken to the Caribbean islands and worked in sugar plantations and things like that. But yeah, it still felt very new, because again, how often do you see it in writing, you know, like this and in such an expansive way? And I hope that we get to read more of it, that there's more of it for us to read. Yeah.
I'm curious what folks thought about a lot of the queer experiences and queer storylines throughout the book.
Loved it. I thought it was very refreshing. I thought it was very real. I loved that that was also part of his identity and discovery and figuring stuff out. Like, I think he's like between 20 and 30 for the bulk of the book, correct? And that's just like such an informative era in your lives. And here he is going from all of these academic settings, but he's also wants to go to these populated cities where there are other brown queer people for him to mingle with. And I was sad with some of the heartbreak and some of the ill experiences, but I was just so glad that he was putting himself out there and doing these things and finding and discovering. And yeah, that was part of the hope and joy of reading it, I think, was some of those situations where he was able to feel those things.
Yeah, I agree with like that he was able to find that queer community finally, after getting, you know, having no acceptance in his own family, and being outed by his cousin, sort of, in this horrible way. And so it was, like you're saying, Amanda, to get to that point of hope and find his own queer community was a really powerful part of the story.
Just want to say I can totally agree with everything y'all just said. To add to that, I really found him being open about his sexual experiences to be meaningful. I think that so much of somebody's self-esteem and their experiences inform their sexual lives. And for somebody to be so frank about that, especially with his stories of being abused by a boyfriend, I was like, thank God. I'm glad this is here in the universe, because it's really important.
Okay, to that point, that was my favorite part about the queer experience, was how explicitly he talked about those things, and not just in like liberal American New York communities, but also in a temple in India. It just like, I love that so much, because I was like, yes, queerness exists everywhere. And it's not this like, I don't know, the sanitize is not the right word, but it's like, it can be explicit, and it can, like, you don't have to hide it behind, coded language, that it exists, and you can see people. Because I think one of the things that I've had to unlearn, and I'm not entirely sure where the messaging came from, but it was just like, like the desexualization, or like, I'm looking for a word, where it's just like, you're like, oh, people aren't like this because they're not as free as out here in the West. People are just, I think you know what I'm talking about, Sheila, or the word.
Like weird, like self-orientalizing, that
yes,
you don't have sexuality at all,
yeah,
purely for reproduction or marriage, and then that's it, and it's like one specific way.
exactly.
And to see any other form of sexuality is to say that you don't respect your own culture.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. That right there. So I mean, I had to unlearn that for myself, and to see him write it and be explicit about it was so joyful for me. I was just like, yes, this right here, like, challenge the notion.
I think I like picked up a lot on the dad, like maybe doing some self-orientalizing and like internalizing this conversion to Christianity. And like his mom seems to have this attitude too of like sex is, or maybe it's Aji that says this, but like sex is like, can't imagine sex being for anything other than reproductive purposes. And then the father just being like, the West has turned you this way, the West made you this way. Like discounting the fact that, yeah, there are queer people everywhere. Like you said, like clearly that's not why.
I also like appreciated the explicitness of his experiences, because I think that when we see that in books, it's usually under this like heteronormative lens, and that doesn't allow so many people to be seen, or to like read something and be like, well, where's my experience in this, or this is not happening for me. So it just was refreshing, as you all have said, to have him be so open about it.
When I think so much of homophobia is rooted in heterosexual people being like, the thought of gay people having sex disgusts me.
Mm.
There's an ick level.
Mhm.
And he said, I'm not investing in that ick level at all. I'm going to tell you how this thing happened. And which is, not to overuse the word, is just really refreshing.
Mm.
I think it was kind of interesting in the chapters where he like fantasizes like what his family said well, I guess fantasize isn't the right word, like a nightmarish fantasy, I guess. And he like kind of uses that tone that you're saying, Jacob, like his family thinks he's disgusting and all this stuff, and makes up this narrative of like what they probably said. And it was like graphically explaining what does a man do to another man, and like, ew, that's gross. So he like is recognizing that this is the broader cultural perspective, and that his family likely has this like his cousin who he thinks is his friend and is like an ally throughout his whole life suddenly just betrays him. And you find out like, oh, your family isn't as good as you thought they were. They're not gonna support you like you thought they were. And I think eventually he does kind of reconnect with his family, but not with the cousin. So a lot of trust is broken there, and like just heteronormative reality comes in and kind of ruins his like safe spaces in his family.
To like the point of or the part in the book where he talks about his abusive relationship, I've been really, I don't know what the right word is, but, and happy feels like a weird word, but I'll use it anyways. Happy to see more stories about complexity and violence in other types of relationships. So like in The Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado, and then this one are just the start of how we can start to think about relationships from a healthy lens, and recognizing that the advice that is given from a straight or cis perspective is not all encompassing and isn't going to protect everybody. And to see stories of what harm can look like is actually very educational, and hopefully prevent that type of harm from being perpetrated in the future, especially in hyper marginalized communities where none of these conversations are happening.
Yeah, definitely have to echo that, especially because there are like so many different layers at play. And I think he does such a beautiful job of showing like the internal insecurities and things that come up that actually make it that actually kind of like almost keeps you in a situation that's bad for you longer than you should be. And I think that he does a really nice job of showing those dynamics, because those dynamics wouldn't be in the heteronormative stories. So I really appreciated that viewpoint as well. And on the note of like challenging, who gets to be a sexual being, I will highly recommend Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows as a read, if you haven't read that, because that really challenges both ageism and sexuality, as well as South Asianness and sexuality, among other things.
Yeah, I listened to it with my husband last summer, and he was very into it. Those are actually all my questions. I actually don't have any more questions. Sorry.
Are there things about the book that you really wanted to talk about that we didn't touch on?
I wanted to discuss more. Elizabeth had brought it up. Those alternate endings.
Mm-hmm.
That I think that was the part of the book that I had the most difficulty reading, because the part of me, and I think that everybody has this in their life where they go, I want to imagine it this way. And it's just like, don't do it, do not do it. Like, oh man. It was meaningful that it was in the book, because it spoke to the truth of that experience of wishing or reimagining or imagining. But it was difficult to read because I think that's something that's so human, and it really is. You're just treading, you're just opening old wounds. And I was like, oh, don't do it, dude.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I had difficulty with those two, reading the alternate endings of what happened with his, or what didn't happen. But I tried to break it down as like, well, he is a writer. This is how he is working through what has happened, is by telling, because I mean, we do that all the time. We think about, oh, I should have done this. I should have said that. Maybe they said this. You worry and you think, whether you're looking forward or looking back. Those are things that we spin it around in our head. And here he is, he's just putting it into a story, which I appreciated. But at the same time, it was also like, but it's done. But he had to do it. That was how he was part of the processing.
Yeah, I think it was very cathartic, especially because a lot of times we'll just sit with anxiety and like notice it from our peripheral vision and not try to address it in any meaningful way, because we're so scared of what that outcome is going to look like. And to be able to imagine multiple versions of it, right? Here's the worst case scenario. Here's like the best case scenario. Here's what might happen. Like that's such a powerful move and a cathartic move. And I think just by showing as an example, I think it's a healing technique that he's putting on display for other people to kind of investigate sources of fear or anxiety that might show up. So it was difficult to read, but I was also like really happy to see it. Yeah.
I'm just flipping through the book.
Yeah.
I think just to get back a little bit to the hybrid piece of this and the mixed sort of like, you can't put it in a genre, and that made me think about like, well, who decides? It's kind of going back to like that decolonization of your books and your reading too. Like, who gets to decide what a genre is? Who told us that? And so I appreciate that he's bucking against that convention as well.
Well, that's sort of like the crux of a lot of what he's talking about or going through, is just that being categorized or put into a column. And if he can't, or his family can't, the book can't either. So part of the hybrid too was the couple sections that he had, the Islamophobic misreadings, some Queen's definitions, and he also had a section on brown inclusion and examples on that. And I really like just those really just like in your face examples of both things.
Yeah, I felt like that section that you just mentioned, Amanda, the misreading,
Islamophobic.
Islamophobic misreading, that really struck me because it like reminded me of the time and place in which the story is taking place. And of course, this is still happening, but at that time it was much more prominent, and like he was going to the airport and getting randomly chosen each time for his things to be searched, and he's not Muslim, that's not his identity, but people just assume that of him based on whatever factors, just American ignorance, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. But I like that the format he chose, like he could have just written like, 4 long pages about this is what we experience, and I've had this and I've had that. It's just very specific examples and multiple locations where similar people are saying things that have the same outcome or effect on him. And same thing with the examples of brown inclusion. Those are some positive things that were happening, but it was like, these are things that are good, these are things that are bad. And I really appreciated that. And again, that just mix of the format for us to take in the information.
That's it. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh no, as I was going to say that as someone who has writing ambitions, I really enjoyed these formats, and I was like, "Ooh, this is interesting. What else can I use this format for?" Because it's a really good way to kind of activate the mind and think specifically about like short narratives. So I really appreciated that. Just being exposed to different forms of writing.
But I also feel like he packed in so much information and so much story, and it was a fairly quick read, and we absorbed so many feelings and so many songs and stories and facts about his family and what he was feeling and what he was going through. And it was very fluid. There wasn't a point where you got through it or you were getting through something. It was just fluid. You were just with him the whole time. I guess that's a sign of a really good writer, is you're just there in there. He was never like preaching at us or telling this thing, or it was just very like sing-songy, and I guess it was poetic. It was just, the way it was done was just really remarkable, and it just really makes me, and I'm not a writer per se, but it just makes me think about the craft of writing and how you can use those words, and when you do it, and he did it. It's just really well done. I hope people read this book. I really do.
And just for people who may not know, Rajiv Mohibar is also a poet. This was actually his first non-poetry book. And as somebody who is not a good reader of poetry, I found this to be a beautiful, I guess, like pathway to poetry, of like understanding the beauty of lyricism and the tightness. It's a tightly written book, and that is like the quintessential idea of poetry. Condense down so many ideas, maybe one idea, maybe many, into one page. And he does this with a book. I'm just now piecing together just how incredible it is that he brings this multimodal, multi-talented, multi-disciplinary approach to writing. And like Fatima says, like it just it helps you reimagine what literature could be like.
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree. It felt very quick to read, but like everyone's saying, there's so much information packed in there, and not in a way that's like, this happened then and this happened. It's like, it just flows out throughout the course of reading. And then we also touched on, like, there were times as readers that don't know the language where we were like stumbling on these large sections, but it felt like a flow throughout, like those sections where I was like, oh, I can't read this. I was like, this is part of the experience of reading it, and an important part of the experience. It didn't feel jarring at all, really.
Okay, this seems like a natural endpoint for us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but this has been a really great discussion.
Yeah. Thank you so much for reading and engaging so thoroughly. Really, really appreciate it. Our February book is a graphic novel. Sorry. I also just finished reading a graphic memoir. So I was like, it's called The Magic Fish by Trung Le Nguyen. And we'll also have the pleasure of talking to the author on Instagram Live next month. So I hope that you are able to join us for that. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you both for being here.
Thank you,
and
guys.
also
It's
for
such a pleasure.
Yeah, for putting this book in our hands. I just really always appreciate getting these books on my radar that I might not have seen otherwise. So thank you so much for that.
Cool. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you. Have a good